So now I think the next session is we have a panel, and the first panel consists of 4 real professional evaluators. I would like to invite the panelists here. Indra Naidu, who is currently the Director of Evaluation at UNDP. And then we have Shiva Kumar, who is also an experienced evaluator and policy advisor from India. And then we have John Gargani, who is the former president of the American Evaluation Association and currently lecturer and professor and co-author of several books. Then we have from the World Bank, IIED, the senior evaluation officer, Maria Westmöllers. Sorry for my pronunciation, it's not really good. And then we have asked that why and why now. So we have lots of different questions. We think that these distinguished panelists try to answer us today. I'm sure that there are more questions and answers, but we are trying to do our best. Such questions as why evaluation matters. We listen to the keynote speakers. We think that the evaluations are very, very important and welcomed and timely. Why to evaluate SDGs, the same thing, we really need to go forward. And as talking about country ownership, I think it's very important for all of us to encourage decision makers at the country level really to do the evaluations and make the policies accordingly. But we feel like Sylvia also said that there is some problems or challenges with the evaluation capacities in the countries. So maybe the panelists would address the issue that what kind of support and what kind of capacities are needed at the country level. So we have 4 short presentations, sort of introductions to these questions and issues, and then we have half an hour time for questions and answers to the panels. So without further delay, so I think that I'll give the floor to the distinguished panelists. Do we start ladies first, or do you have any preference order?
No preference.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, I'll start. So I don't have a presentation because Ada told me I didn't need one. So, so I followed the rules. But thank you very much for inviting me. It's nice to see all of you, some new faces and some faces, some friends that I know. So we were asked a set of questions. And do you want me to speak to those right now?
It's up to you.
Okay.
So that, you know.
So one of the questions was about, like, how do we reverse the situation related to the difficulty with people doing evaluation, or the slowness in undertaking the evaluations and so forth. And so how do we reverse it, and why is it important? And I thought I'd start off by saying, we're talking about 3 things. The first is that, to me, it all flows from leadership. So if you don't have leadership around these issues, things will not go forward. So as much as we can be advocating with and for leadership in these areas, other things should flow more easily. So if you're fighting that battle, that's a problem. So one thing I would recommend is different types of advocacy programs with leadership development programs around evaluating SDGs and so forth. Another area that I thought is sort of interesting is, I was in Russia earlier in the fall, meeting with the Russia Supreme Audit Agency, the equivalent to for those in the US, the equivalent to the GAO. But they've had more of a traditional audit function that a lot of us would know, whereas GAO has a more of an evaluation experience. But in any event, so it seems as though potentially there are allies in different countries in working with Supreme Audit agencies, because it seems as though they are moving into the evaluation space more and more. They're diversifying. Russia is chair this year of the INTOSAI, the International Supreme Audit Agency, or International Organization for Supreme Audit Agencies. And they're taking very much the sort of a transformational approach to how audit agencies work. Since audit agencies are in most countries, potentially these could be allies for us. So Moscow, or Russia, held a conference sometime in the last year where they brought together all the audit agencies globally. I think they get together every 2 or 3 years. And something was announced called the Moscow Declaration, where, I don't know, did you know that the issue about SDGs is front and center in this Moscow Declaration, which is a declaration that comes out of their international organization. So, and it's basically issues around how do governments and supreme audit agencies help governments in evaluating, or at least looking at targets for related to the SDGs. So I thought that was very interesting that they're getting, I wouldn't necessarily think that national audit agencies are so focused on evaluating SDGs, but it seems as though that's something that's going to be happening. At least they're going to be making the attempt. And the third thing would be that I think I don't know. I always like, when I'm teaching evaluation, I like to say, when does evaluation start? When does it start? I'm asking you. Does it start at the end, or does it start at the beginning? It starts at the beginning, right? So as much as those of us who are working in the evaluation community can be working with agencies and other partners, thinking about evaluation at the beginning. So thinking about evaluation when national plans are developed, and thinking about evaluation as countries are thinking about the SDGs, and don't wait till the end, I guess, is the message. And so much as we can be encouraging countries to do that, that would be important. Another question was about capacity building that you had, Anu, and I guess one message would be that capacity building it's not training. Training is a part of capacity building. So we want to be thinking about capacity building in a broader way and a multifaceted way. So, I mean, I can break it down into 4 categories that we use, but there could be other dimensions under that. But, training is one, advisory is one, knowledge and research projects are one, and also knowledge sharing. So we want to be thinking about how these things all knit together, and how we connect with those with whom we are working on evaluation capacity development initiatives. And tying back to my first point, I also think developing capacity building programs with and for leaders is really going to be essential too. Oh, sorry. And I know that you're doing fantastic work with parliamentarians, but I think that there are other leaders too that we can even be thinking about more broadly in maybe a more cohesive manner, and trying to reach them the same way you've done parliamentarian work. And I'm going to turn it over because I think I'm probably out of time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maria. Very important and interesting points which we need to elaborate a little bit further. But maybe, John, you would like to continue?
Yes.
Do you need some slides?
Do have some slides, and I need the clicker. Either I didn't follow the rules, or I followed some different rules, depending on how you look at it. So thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. My name is John Gargani, and I have done evaluations for quite some time, over a couple of decades in various places around the world. And today, the questions that were posed to us seem to be about how we could take the SDGs, which currently are slightly out of focus as we look at them, and make them more in focus within countries and across countries. I don't think that there's any answer that one of us can give that's going to provide a full and satisfactory report on how to do this. Each one of us works in some little narrow part of the world, and so I'm going to talk about my little narrow part of the world, and that might help shed light on the larger problem that we're engaging in, and bring up some questions for us later. I would say that in thinking about the SDGs, from my perspective, there are 4 things that seem to matter quite a lot. There's global partnership, evidence-based action, the interests of all, and independent evaluation. Those four things seem to need to be a part of it. But in the real world, there's a tension between those, and there are countervailing forces, which would be local independence, evidence-free action, self-interest, and self-reported success. I mean, that's sort of how the world works on its own. And the SDGs, I think, promote what I would consider to be an appropriate idealistic balance between the two. They have an idealistic view about how this should be done, and I think that's the right thing to propose. But I do think that as those ideals hit the real world, the balance that we found hasn't been satisfactory. And the question is how to make it more satisfactory. Rather than consider many of the pieces that I know we have been talking about in various locations around this, I'd like to reframe the question slightly differently and say, well, what is the opportunity for us as evaluation professionals to learn and improve from seeing something in the real world not be exactly how we would like it to be or how we intended it to be when we started? Now, the lens I bring to this is really colored by the work I've been doing recently, which is around this book on scaling impact. So it's a particular view on how to scale impact, how to think about scaling. It's based on the work of reviewing the work of over 200 Southern innovators, working with them to try to develop some understanding of what scaling means in the Global South. And that was distilled really into 4 principles in the book. We provide 5 case studies, and I'd say that our overarching purpose is to present a different mindset around scaling. And if you want it, you can get it for free. So I'm not trying to sell you a book. I'm trying to offer you something that you can read. It's published by Routledge and the International Development Research Center. IDRC makes it available for free. You can get it right there at that link. If you can't figure out how to make something like that work, you can contact me, or I'm sure somebody here who can connect you with it, or you can just Google it and find it. So the 4 principles, very quickly, are justification, optimal scale, coordination. I have to keep turning around. Dynamic evidence. I feel like Vanna White. So justification is based on the idea that there's no obligation to scale. There's some things you don't want to scale. You have to justify why you're scaling something. So every effort to promote the SDGs isn't necessarily something you want to bring to fruition. Optimal scale is that whatever you're trying to bring about in the world is probably not maximized by doing as much as possibly could be done. There's probably some intermediate point which brings about the optimal good. Where is that? How do you find it? Coordination is around the idea that you're probably not going to do this alone. You probably need other organizations and partners, and that coordination is a very important part of the effort that you have to undertake. And dynamic evaluation is the idea that you're conducting evaluation in a complex environment, but when you scale, you are actually changing the way the complex environment works. So this is a dynamic element that you don't have when you typically think about evaluation. So there are 4 dimensions we consider important to look at, not the only 4. Magnitude is one that almost everybody looks at: how much, how many, how big. But we have 3 others to consider. Variety. What are all the different kinds of impacts that you're bringing around? And I think the SDGs is a good example of trying to suggest that there's a variety of things we should be trying to accomplish, not just focusing on one thing. Equity, who actually ends up benefiting, who is losing. And sustainability, not necessarily promoting a sustainable planet, though that's good, but the sustainability of the impacts themselves. So very quickly on the evaluation side, and this is my last bit, if we think about the relationship between action and impact, that's probably the primary thing that evaluators have always considered, right? And we might broadly think about that as impact evaluation. We now consider quite a lot the role that context plays and how action brings about impact. And that might be put under the label of realist evaluation. And those represent the 2 relationships that evaluators spend most of their time thinking about. But with scaling, and I think the SDGs are an example of that, probably the most prominent example of trying to scale something up, all of this changes. Because the reason you're scaling is to change actions in a way that change impacts. And if you do change those impacts when scaling up, they have the potential to change the context, which then has the potential to change how the impacts are brought about by your actions. And the act of scaling itself, not just changing the actions, but the things you do around scaling, where the money goes, how you build infrastructure, all of that may change the context as well. So we've moved from a world in which evaluators are focused really on 2 relationships when they're evaluating, to one where we should probably be considering 5. And these are very complicated types of relationships. And as evaluators, we may not have all of the tools at our fingertips to figure out how to do this. So for me, the opportunity to learn and to improve is to think more broadly about these relationships and to bring that information to actors in a timely way so they can make the scaling up effort as effective as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think that 6 minutes was not enough to present your book, so we need another book launch. Thank you very much. It was very interesting and certainly worth reading. So I think next, Shiva, would you? Or Imran, yeah, please. I don't have one, but you can also. All right, okay, please, Imran.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to enter the discussion in terms of the practical work that the IEO of UNDP does in building national evaluation capacity, and many of you have been engaged with it at some level or the other. Taking from the opening address at Hurghada in Egypt in October, Amina Mohammed made the point that the implementation of the SDGs can be accelerated globally by bolstering evaluation, a powerful tool that improves public accountability and contributes to positive development change. So we use that as the framing to amplify the whole question of evaluation into the agenda, moving away from monitoring to evaluation. We know there's a lot of monitoring, but it doesn't answer the question in terms of the deeper analysis. So at the 2019 event, over 3 days, we had 5 plenaries, 21 parallel sessions, over 500 participants, and over 100 countries engaging. This is the largest evaluation event by government participation globally. And the focus is to exchange practices and ideas so that it is nationally owned and is bottom up. So it's moving away from the notion of expert and agenda. The experts are the people in the room, the participants that we have, and we've had the series over a long period of time. I just go back in terms of 2017 when shortly after the SDGs was launched, and we had the Director of Sustainable Development make a point, and also at this event, we had Pedro, the Director of UNDP, the HDRO, providing a keynote. So focusing and bringing it to the question of measurability, leaving no one behind and what that actually means. And on the PowerPoint, the links are available. All the information, all the training sessions, all the presentations are on our public website as part of the information. It's been a long journey. It's really about cumulatively 1,600 participants over 160 countries, national authorities, prospective commissioners of evaluation, and a by invitation event has been the way in which it has been evolving. The part of capacity, again, goes to using trainers from around the world in workshops that offer a range of skilling on the various ways in which you can evaluate SDGs. So it's very concrete, very practical, and we have put onto our repository all the training materials for everyone to access, because we believe it is really, the point is a public good. And the final part, of course, coming into, I think your guideline, congratulations, is going to be very important, will be complemented on this, we have spoken about it, is we've got a diagnostic tool where you're able to do baseline assessments in all countries, and on the basis of that, work out how to move forward. We've had Senegal that was quite active, and a whole lot of others where it's coming through. So the governments themselves are actually showing an initiative. Of course, what is missing and has been raised is civil society voice is not strong enough. There isn't enough of the non-state actors and sectors. And of course, as we've noticed with the VNRs, the element that is really missing is the question of evaluation. So I'll just pause then, we'll take questions. But the framing we have, and most of you have been involved in the next series, it's a UN event, is really to bring together thought leadership, but focusing again on how do we get to leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Imran. Very important and valuable work on capacity building. Much appreciated. Shiva, what do you want to tell us?
Yeah, thank you. For the join me. Hi, yeah. Thank you. I think it's a great advantage going last because almost everything has been said, and I completely agree with a lot of the things. I wanted to pick up this thing which was mentioned about self-reported success. I think that's an important thing in this post-truth era to keep in mind. We also call it sometimes policy-based evidence making. So, so we have shifted away from evidence-based policy making to policy. And then also, I think this question of use of evidence to inform or influence decision making is another important question somebody raised, because it's not very obvious that decision makers actually use the evidence. And there are many other political factors and other considerations that come in. I just want to just underscore 3 or 4 things that I picked up from the earlier speakers. First is, I think there's a real opportunity to push the SDGs, particularly because of 3 factors. As I speak now as an economist, there is a growing disillusionment with economic growth. Economic growth has been there, but it's also slowing down. There's a great amount of concern with unemployment. There's a concern with growing inequalities. The uncertainties of climate change are even confounding these problems even more. And so the focus really is now on how do we ensure security in the lives of people, how do we enhance freedoms and capabilities and opportunities. So I think the discussion is really focused on that, and pushing the SDGs is actually the answer to how to actually bring about this transformational change in the lives of people. The second is I want to make a comment on this country ownership, country-led country ownership. I could not agree with it more, but country ownership should not be equated only to government ownership. And I think we very quickly fall into that trap. So somebody mentioned, I think Indran mentioned about nationalizing or adapting the SDGs to country contexts. In India, they've done it at the state level. And some states are even taking it to the localization of the SDGs, because ultimately transformational change is about changes in people's lives. And so you want change to happen right there. And it can never happen if you're monitoring at the top. In fact, even on climate action reports, we find you have the National Plan for Climate Action, state plans for climate action, but very little is really, you have to have climate action taking place at the community level. And I think that ownership, how do you take SDGs to that level to bring about transformational change is important. So these are the 2 big things. And third, I think just to recognize the importance of the guidebook, I think recognizing the interconnectedness of SDGs is a defining feature on how to get this transformational change. It's not easy, and so guidebooks, methods, new methodologies, real-time evaluations, etc., become even more important. So those are 3 general comments. 4 asks of how to speed up things. Let me say that, first of all, I endorse what has already been said about the importance of communicating the findings. The communication to decision makers, politicians, through the media, through civil society organizations, to build public pressure on the state to perform and deliver is extremely important. And I find the disconnect is quite strong. Evaluators do the evaluation reports, but that jump from findings to influence is missing. The second, I think Sylvia raised this also about scale and sustainability, and so the others. So obviously, when we're answering the question, what works and why, and where, we can't now be looking at small pilots. Governments really want to know on scale what is happening. I think the award of the Nobel award to the champions of RCT again brings us back into the concentration on this. RCT might be the most rigorous form, or as they used to say, the gold standard for evaluation. But the big question is, can an RCT be really scaled up? So you spend a lot of money on that, because when you scale up these RCTs, you really find very little impact because it's disconnected from the context of the environment and cultures in which scaling up takes place. So I think that brings it into question. Sustainability of large-scale interventions is a big question. The cost effectiveness, which nobody ever talks about. I've rarely seen evaluation reports that talk about the cost effectiveness. Yes, it worked, but how expensive was it? Because the stumbling block today is going to be the finance ministry that says we don't have any resources for scaling up. And that's why we run into problems of sustainability, poor implementation, because the resource costs haven't really been budgeted. Third, I think the question of averages, I think it was also brought about. I think the SDGs really call for disaggregated data. In addition to asking what works, where, when, and why, we have to also add for whom. And when you add the next W for whom, it becomes very critical to adopt an equity lens, a human rights lens, a gender perspective, to really find out what is working for whom. The last point I want to make, and I'll stop there, has to do with the capacity building and training and so on and so forth. This is nothing new. I mean, agencies have been trying this for 30 years, 40 years, capacity building, and it doesn't seem to go anywhere. And I often sometimes, in a lighter vein, I say, has anybody done an evaluation of what are the lessons learned from capacity building, and why do we continue to do more of the same? Or if you're not doing more of the same, and I think that's what George was trying to say, you have to be disruptive. You have to do something very differently. And what can be done very differently, because we know what the traditional methods are and they are not working. And here again, I'll go back to a point that the earlier speakers have made, is to tap into the richness of knowledge and wisdom that lies in countries of the South. That you have to wake up and say that in these countries, communities know what is happening, communities know what is working. You really have to go down to that level and understand the context, the wisdom, the experience, the knowledge that exists in the South, in these countries, and see how you can capitalize that and make that the basis for any kind of capacity building exercise. So I would really push for much greater South-South cooperation, much greater respect for civil society organizations working on the ground, that it's not just that the outsiders know what they're doing and right or wrong. These people have some value to add, and how to bring them into the fold of developing, engaging them in capacity building for evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva. Very important points, and thank you for commenting that the previous speakers. So are you now ready for the questions, or do you want me to keep repeating the questions? Maybe I would like to sort of, you mentioned that the one thing is how to encourage really the South conduct their evaluations. I think we all agree that it's important to conduct the evaluations, but how to encourage, because now there is only Nigeria from South who is about to start their evaluations, and in the North there is only Finland who has completed, and there are about 170 countries planning to submit their VNRs. So the maths don't count, so that why the evaluation haven't taken place? How do you encourage the local decision makers and stakeholders and audiences to go for evaluations? Who would like to start? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's not so much an issue of encouragement, but also the fact that doing an evaluation report upwards that puts your performance or lack of it in the international and public domain is a political question. And that's not spoken about. It's sort of coded. So what you are finding in the VNRs are all these monitoring reports, and that is both the North and South, the quality of which do not meet a criteria for evaluation. They do talk about progress, which is fine. I think it's a journey. But it reflects two things at a further level. One is the limited evaluative capacity in countries, North and South. And the second issue is that the parts of the system are not working. So you don't have this, the different elements articulating and bringing up evaluation. And then I think the earlier speech that we got from Red, like the different types of evaluation, there's still great levels of different understanding of evaluation. So when we sit in here and we expected to really give a judgment about what the past performance is in order to move forward, others don't see it that way. And it's more than a communication. It's actually very, very complicated. And that is the feedback that we were getting in the NEC conference when we had the governments, mentioning it, it's more than a technical issue. And that hasn't been unpacked.
Um, I think this will be an easy answer, but I think one of the things that will definitely help are more and more examples, like the one that we have from Finland, and having the frameworks available for people to sort of look at and refer to and adapt and adopt for their own circumstances. So, in my view, putting a lot of energy in these early years into working with countries and agencies and civil society and helping to develop the frameworks would be of high value, because people want to see what others have done.
Yeah, very quickly. I think the problem with when you go with evaluations to people in government is that there's a certain defensiveness, that you come here to tell me what is not working. And I think that can be easily flipped over as a political opportunity to say, we will tell you what works. And in fact, most people in government want to know, tell us about success, tell us what is working, tell us more about what to do than what is not working. And I think it's a problem of communication. And I think if we recognize that it's not a technical exercise, but the findings have to be packaged and conveyed and communicated as a political outcome of the evaluation, then there's a lot that can be achieved in terms of creating a demand for evaluation from the people. And then when I said, when you link it to media, television debates, civil society organizations, asking for, tell us why is it working and how is it working, I think that demand generation might be the way to disrupt the what should I say, the culture of evaluation.
You're going to keep asking us these questions until we give you answers, right? Is that the way this works? I think one component might be promoting meta-evaluation. So producing these evaluations is not going to happen overnight. Countries aren't going to gain the capacity or the desire to do it instantly. But as they become available, if there is a group that can look at them and say, well, here is what makes them better. We're learning from each of these reports as they're coming through, and we can provide some meta-evaluative criteria that allows us to understand when the evaluations are stronger or weaker. I think that gets to helping to provide a guide. It's not just copying what's done, but aspiring towards the ideal that's emerging from the reality of the work that's there. So some capacity to do that, I think, would be applying what we know about evaluation, how to develop criteria and standards, and doing it around the evaluations themselves.
If I could just tag on to that last point, I also think developing sort of a cadre of people who've done this and making them available to others to serve in some kind of advisory role would also be helpful. So somehow collecting names and experiences of individuals or firms that have helped on these reports would be useful.
Yeah. Thank you. Before, Imran, I asked you a question. So you said that there are different kinds of evaluations, so what kind of evaluations are needed. But I really would like to emphasize the learning aspect of the evaluations. So you said that people are defensive because they are afraid that what kind of results come out from the evaluations. But how could we emphasize more about the learning aspect of the evaluations? Because that's a part of the communication story, to communicate the lessons learned and why these evaluations are conducted.
I think the debate internationally on almost a dichotomy between evaluation for learning and accountability, we've moved a long way past that. We know it's both. The word evaluation connotes judgment, and automatically there is a fight or flight psychological reaction to it, whether it's from government or people or whatever. And that's because that's what the word means, to give judgments. That is consistent with our UNICEF norms and standards in terms of the definition of it. And quite often evaluators, we don't want to get caught into that tricky part of independence and evaluation and judgment, then start emphasizing learning, but to the point where it is not evaluation. So I'm not saying it's a balancing act, it's complex. I would suggest, and what we have seen that helped some of the transformation at the UNDP, is if you emphasize process a lot more in the evaluation, that's where the learning comes. by engaging, by taking people through the loop, by making sure that they're constantly consulted and taking a more facilitative approach, that by the time you come to the end, the report doesn't matter because there has been that engagement. But that involves a very sophisticated type of communication that evaluators often don't have because they're locked into the report. That's it. The report is simply a product, but the evaluation is the product of, is the process which brings about the learning. So just by changing the methodological approach and adding more steps in and engaging more and actually beginning to empathize with the groupings and to work in a truly participative way, which is another word that has been quite undermined because it's almost symbolic participation. You know, you can do it. And of course, that takes time and it takes resources and it's not easy.
That is exactly what I wanted to comment, so that people start designing the evaluation when the evaluation results are actually already needed. So then the people, they don't have patience for this process learning. So they try straight away to get the results. And that's a challenge always, the timing of the evaluations.
To carry on to that point, we have something in my office now called a learning engagement evaluation, which is, it's not like our typical evaluation, which would, you know, maybe take a year and a lot of money to produce, but it's something that is sort of done in a very short period of time, and it's very participatory. It's the shaping of the question is very consultative. And it's, there's no real final product as such, but I mean, maybe some small little report, but the idea is to engage with the counterparts who care about the issue, and to almost create like a venue or opportunities for them to exchange with one another. And that was, people have a much different attitude towards that, you know, as you were saying. So it's something new that we're trying. We're finding it's very successful. But it does require the right type of skills.
Yeah. Let me, as a social scientist, say that you have to link evaluation and research together. Because in social science, we ask long-term questions. What should we do to end discrimination against girls and women in India, let's say? So that's a big question. Or have to look at structural questions. You have to look at issues of inherent patriarchy, discrimination, and all that kind of thing. Then I come with an intervention to give cash incentives for young girls. And what you find that, you know, there are these cash incentives at different stages. You've done it for till the age of 18. And at the age of 18, this young woman gets a certain amount of money from the government. If at 18 you haven't gotten married. Now, has that done anything to change the position of women in society? Very little, very little. So if you ask about fundamental question that I want to design an intervention that is going to improve the status of women in this country, give them greater opportunities to join the workforce, etc., then you think of the intervention you need and the questions you want to ask. Unfortunately, evaluations have got a very short period. They're by nature not long. So all these underlying structural factors are sort of kept on the side burner, and then you say, in this given context, did it work or not? And people will tell you that has very limited use.
Yeah, I think this is just another case of the ideal that we aspire to and the reality being out of sync. If you asked an evaluator how to make evaluations be effective, they would say, you have to get in from the very beginning, it has to be cooperative, you have to be bringing in the voice and the control of the people who are affected by the efforts. You need to take a long-term view, you have to learn over many iterations, you have to continue the evaluation for a long period of time. Like those answers aren't going to change. We've been saying that since at least the 1950s, 1930s, like for a very long time. It's just that is not, doesn't fit into the reality of how organizations, governments function. So there's a mismatch. And I do believe that one big part of it is this political dimension, which we tend not to talk about, and some of it's this cost dimension that we don't talk about. And both of those perhaps require a certain level of courage among those who are taking action on to benefit other people. That you have to be willing to do what seems reasonable, make your best effort towards making it work, and be courageous enough to see what happens and make that transparent to others. It's that lack of courage, perhaps, that is one of the more fundamental challenges we have. And we can hopefully make it less scary, but I don't think we do that by removing judgment. There always has to be judgment. Really a question of whose judgment and how open people are to not just listening to it, but desiring to know it.
Thank you. Now I would like to open the floor for the audience. So if you have any questions, so that please go ahead and you can address them to the whole panel or just a particular member of the panel. Thank you.
Hi, lovely to see friends again. I want to pick up on John's last point around courage, because I think this nails it. We are the commissioners. Commissioners can change this. Commissioners are the ones that have the power to shape things differently, to get different voices in the room, to insist that it be done differently. I think there's a real opportunity here to think about how we step up to that challenge, because I think we're failing miserably in the courage department. I really do. And for those of you who know me, you'll know this has been my mantra for a long time in a lot of sectors. But how is it that we step up and be more courageous? We love to use the speaking truth to power phrase. Do we really? We don't. We back away from that more times than we step up to it. So I'd love to hear now. I mean, the house is on fire, to use dear Greta's term. And what are we doing? What are we doing? So I'd love to turn this into a how do we be more courageous? And how do we step up to the challenge of reframing how we address the SDGs, how we take the opportunity to bring real voices to the table. No mention of private sector in here today. Huge drivers of change in countries in the world. We need to do this differently. I'd love to hear your views. Thank you.
Let's take a couple of more questions and then let the panel answer. I think there was a trend. Kindly present yourself also. Thank you.
To be with the UN, with UNICEF until 2 years ago, right here in the evaluation office. In the last 2 years, actually, I have shifted my focus more on the national systems, how they work. Still keeping the results focus in the context of SDGs, evidence focus, research focus, analysis, all these things we are talking about, evaluation. And I mean, there are many good news there that I could also relate to. But we don't see this kind of discussion trickling down to national level. And let's not even think about sub-national level now, but even at the national level, central level there, unfortunately, we still don't have a situation where we can say, wow, people are really talking about it. All the ideas here that we are talking about, what we have been talking about past decades and so on, it has not trickled down. At least I can claim that in the context of South Asia. We don't know what the bottlenecks are. We don't know why there is not incentive on the part of policymakers, planners, decision makers, in terms of looking at evidence, looking at data, look at evaluation positively and put it to work, especially in the context of SDGs. One other news is that actually the motivation and the quality of the governance, if we look at it, again, I can name a couple of countries in South Asia, this is not very positive news. We can link this to brain drain as well. We don't have top-class people going into public sector. While the ambitions are greater, the challenges are greater. Funding is going up too, but we don't have that evidence that the funding is being put rightly in terms of delivering results, because there are all kinds of rent-seeking behaviors, if I can stretch it. If we look at the result, I mean the Transparency International, the corruption index, there are 50 or so countries that are at the bottom where they have been for many, many years. So my plea is, when and how will these discussions really reach the national level parties there, including bilateral, multilateral donors, private, and the civil society, the taxpayers, because that will be the real beginning.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Nasreen, and I work with OIOS, the evaluation section. Regarding capacity buildings and SDGs, I'm wondering how that would work, like in failed states, such as in Afghanistan, where I don't think the priority of the government is to work on the SDGs right now. And there is actually, like two governments running at the same time. So how would we sort of address those kind of contexts?
Maybe we let the panelists to respond to these questions and then we can continue. Okay.
I feel like I've had the advantage twice now, going last and having time to collect my thoughts. Well, thank you again for some really easy questions for us to answer. I think that with evaluation, historically, it's been less about speaking truth to power as it has been mumbling highly qualified conjectures to people who aren't really listening. And this has been part of the problem. As evaluators, we don't always have sufficient standing to be heard, which is one of the challenges we have with the SDGs as well. I agree that trying to bring this kind of conversation to a country level or even within a country is quite important. I have absolutely no idea how that happens. And it's made more complex by our last questioner. The context of every country is so different, and every country is dealing with very different sets of circumstances that make it more or less attractive or possible for them to do that. I suppose one of the questions I would ask in response to this is what sort of time horizon do we put on this? We have these deadlines, 2020, 2030, we keep coming up with them. But if we're looking all the way down the road, how long do we have to make this work? And if we feel that the road is short, how willing are we to do something that is entirely different to make that happen? So I like the fact that we have these deadlines, 2030, whatever it is. Keep moving them along. It gives us something to focus on. It gives us a place to get to. But it does sometimes obscure the fact that if we look at the whole journey, it may not last much longer than 2030. And if we believe that, then maybe we want to do something that is quite radically different.
Thank you. I think for me, even before we go into on what to do with evaluations, I think we need a new narrative of development itself. A new narrative of development, because given the existing framework of development in which we're operating, the probability that evaluation will make such a big difference is quite limited. So we have to really change the discourse at a bigger level on what is happening to people's lives, look at the climate impacts, the human impacts of climate change. There are such massive disturbances of extreme weather on the lives of ordinary people. None of this has been really factored into the development discourse. I think that is a very important, necessary condition, I think, for this to happen. I think courage, yes, courage is needed, but I sort of agree with you. Only with about 20% confidence can you really start up and say as an evaluator that yes, this is really this is the thing. So I sort of agree with you, but I also believe that unless we generate a public debate and discussion and engagement, and that's what you're also suggesting, how do we do it? But not with government, but with a much broader constituency at much lower levels of governance. That and generate some excitement. It can. Afghanistan, I have no answer to that question. I think people from the United Nations may be able to answer that better. But it's not just Afghanistan. Let me tell you that. Even if you come to countries, there are different provinces within countries which are very different. South India is very different from North India. The kind of discourse you can have in South India will be very different from what you can have in North India. So every country itself, you will find very different situations and contexts which may or may not be conducive to being critical. And I think that's a challenge to all countries.
I think I'll respond to the first question about elect the commissioners, and how do we have more courage? To some extent, I think some of it can be structural. So you have the right structures in place that can be helpful. So, for instance, I just worked on something. I was lending some of my time to a project where, and we set up an independent body to review the evaluation questions and to review the evaluation as it was being completed. Is in the education sector, and there were people who had nothing to do with the organization, but they were working in the sector. You know, their stake in this was, it was a short consultancy, just to pay for their time to be on this body. But you know, we felt that that was useful to give us really sort of independent or unbiased views about how the evaluation was shaped and what the evaluation said. And it was, you know, relatively low cost. We cast a wide net to try to find people who could be in those roles. Of course, we had a part in making the selection, but even that was fairly sort of limited. So to me, actually, when you can set up bodies like that to give you sort of a true and separate sort of voice and a perspective, that can be helpful.
Thank you very much. I mean, just a quick one. I have discovered in the 8 years at the UNDP, the Independent Evaluation Office, and the next series, which we have gone through 6 iterations, engaging with overall 170 countries, that the variability is extremely high. And I find it difficult to sometimes grapple that with the broad generalizations one has about, you know, where it is right now. It's complex. It's highly complex, highly variable. And only when you get into those contexts, which you begin to understand at 2 levels. One, the level when the invited governments are presenting the evaluation challenges at a global forum like the NEC, or when you are conducting independent country program evaluations, which we do at scale in the UNDP, you begin to understand the variability. And in that variability is the question of scale, which was brought up, the national, the provincial, the local, and within that is also the question of averages. So I would suggest, as we look at it, we don't have the power we think we do. We are the ones who execute what's given to us, you know, on the plate. We need to be we need to be quite modest that we are one of many players in this overall policy environment, but use the space as best we can. The fact that the UN has announced SDGs is not meaning it's going to happen, right? Because a lot of it is really symbolic, that what happens at the, you know, at the levels. But the devil's in the detail, and I would invite everyone once again to look into our website, and you'll see the variability, and you'll be quite, even in countries like Afghanistan. I just completed an evaluation a few weeks ago there. Yeah, it's on the agenda, SDGs, but being on the agenda doesn't mean much is happening. So, and the same applied for countries of the north, as we discovered in Istanbul, that they were as battling with the issue as countries of the south. And also to go away from this notion of the global north and south, because in a context in where we work, these dichotomies actually are quite unhelpful, right? And the whole question of power dynamics and now aid flows, etc., has all fundamentally changed. But you know, sometimes I just get the sense that let's get into the detail, and from there you'll begin to understand that the complexity. You cannot generalize about regions. I worked in the RELAC region. Variability, just moving a few countries down or moving to the side, is extremely high. The tendency of evaluators is one to make the judgment on the broad generalization, which makes us extremely arrogant, because we're doing so on a basis that is not informed by evidence and complexity, because it's much more comfortable.
Thank you. I think we can go to the second round of questions. And Sylvia, at least you had something in your mind.
Thank you very
Thank you very much. Very, very inspiring and challenging words. And trying to think about changing the narrative. I think this is very important. And Nancy knows my obsession with discussing concepts like beneficiaries, for example, because I think we imagine very empowering participatory processes, and we speak about beneficiaries, which is a very, I don't know, paternalistic approach, but also we don't know if they benefited until we finalize the evaluation, probably. So, but I was thinking about something that we have been working and that in a way connects new paradigms or ideas with concrete things, and it's a competency-based approach, because I think we also need to discuss the paradigm and the competencies, which I like very much because they connect knowledge with the capacity of doing things, and also with being, with values, with principles. So I think that we have to also start rediscussing the competencies we need for evaluation actors, not only evaluators, and I think South Africa made a nice exercise to think about competencies for commissioners and managers too, gender focused, I think, but it's a very nice exercise. So I think we need to rethink those. And actually, Michele Tarsiglia has a nice presentation that he did in Guanajuato in 2017 on new competencies needed to address the SDGs as evaluators, but also as other actors. So I'm trying to think, and also I will finalize, and I would like actually to know your feedback and maybe some good practices, because in recent doctoral thesis that is being finalized in my region shows that actually academic programs that I recognize are only one part of capacity building, but they have stayed like very traditional, focusing on a technical approach, ignoring the political and the ethical dimensions of evaluation. So I think we need to boost and give a message to the academia also.
Thank you, Silvia. You can give it to Kasim behind you.
Qasim Siddiq, Vice Chair of EVALSDG. I think I'm intrigued with the discussion, and I just want to bring another dimension that seems to be we lost track of it, obviously, not only in this session, but probably in the various discourse on evaluation. I think to the extent that we're calling for a change in mindset in evaluation, I'm trying to advocate for a change in mindset in planning and programming. Most often, evaluation is reactive to project design, to program design and implementation. But to a large extent, being it ex ante or post ante, it's not an issue. But most often, and the case is planning is rigid, and planning, regardless of the political dimension, regardless of the budget constraints, it's rigid, and it doesn't allow for reflections, it doesn't allow for reviews, it doesn't allow for evaluative thinking throughout the process. And I would bet that if we inject a bit of these throughout the implementation, then the independent external evaluator would add little value to a large extent to the reflections that would be brought up by the internal staff or internal program staff and project staff. I would rather see the change in mindset in the planning while considering the change in mindset in the evaluation. And I would open a parenthesis here saying that what Sylvia is trying to advocate in terms of the transformative evaluation is precisely to address these issues of rigid mindset in the planning phase, rigid mindset in the whole process of planning, programming, and guess what? We're short of money, we're short of time, and we have to squeeze evaluation at the last moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasim. I think we are running out of time, so I would like panelists to respond to these two questions or comments, and then if you have final key messages to the audience or development partners or governments. Thank you.
Final message, be practical. What they've been asking for in all the engagements that I've been working across the globe is guidelines, tools, simple things, right? And so that they can get the job done. And this is what they want, whether it's practitioners, whether it's the civil society and the communities. Therefore, I think this initiative of this is very significant, right? Because there isn't enough of this, but there's no shortage of ideas on the virtues of the SDGs. What they want to get is practical.
Okay. Thank you. Be practical.
You know, in my view, people working in planning need evaluation skills. So I very much agree with that. So as much as we can encourage the planning teams to have evaluators or those with evaluative skills in their teams would be really important. And then finally, just on the issue of competencies, I'm not sure, Sylvia, if you're on this committee now with AEA, there's a kind of renewal looking at the different competencies across agencies and countries. Okay. Okay, so it's an open committee, and the first, so Tessie Katsambas, who is this year's president, has pulled together a community, and it's still an open group as for people to join. There's only been one meeting so far, but the idea is to look across, and not even quite sure what the end product would be, if there would be an end product, but I think the idea is that we need to re-energize the issue around competencies, and I think what you said about thinking about SDGs and competencies is very important.
Well, around the competencies, I feel like that is something that the evaluation community can take some fault for. I mean, we've been trying to establish, develop, articulate these for decades in a way that I don't think has been particularly effective. We do need to understand what they are, and they need to be forward-looking because the world is changing. We also need more places where people can gain those competencies. So academic institutions, there are few that teach evaluation, but we need many other venues where people who aren't going to take an academic track can become skilled evaluators. Around the design piece, that's a matter that's near and dear to my heart. Way back in 2016, when I was president of the American Evaluation Association, the theme of my conference was design and evaluation. So the idea that evaluation gets built in from the beginning, that not just the evaluation is built in from the beginning and you're designing the evaluation and the program and the effort simultaneously, but evaluative thinking is guiding the design process. Right, so that is something which I think we've been talking about in evaluation since at least the 1950s. I can find very nice citations describing exactly what I just said. It's never become part of our culture or our competencies. So yes, I'd say be practical. That's a great bottom line. I would also say be radical so that we can bring these new ideas in and not just repeat what we have been doing.
Thank you. Let me add two more. Be modest and be honest. And let me end on a funny note by recounting a joke that Dave Allen, he's an Irish stand-up comedian, says, and it's so relevant to us. The Pope and atheists are having a heated debate. And obviously, you know the subject, the existence of God. After about 3 hours of debating and discussing, the Pope is very frustrated. And he tells the atheist, you know what? You're like a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat when it is not there. So the atheist is quite surprised and tells the Pope, wow, that's so much like me. Both of us are similar in many respects. You're also like a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat when it is not there. The only difference is you say you have found it. So with that level of honesty and modesty, we need to be very truthful about what we find and what we don't find and report that accurately.
Thank you, panelists. It has been very lively discussions, and at least I have learned a lot, and I have even more questions than what I have when I enter this room. But I also got very many answers, so thank you very much. And audience, thank you very much for active participation. Thanks.